Welcome to Vanished Vail, the series where we take you to Vail's special places. Now, last time we sat down with historian David Devine to learn more about the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo and the Gadsden Purchase. Now let's jump back into that interview to learn more about the business schemes and the political maneuvering that brought a transcontinental rail line right through southern Arizona.
The Civil War had begun in 1861. A dozen southern states had seceded. That meant the political power in Washington had shifted dramatically.
Yes.
There was no longer an impediment to a transcontinental rail line being built because there were no Southerners to oppose it. And so there were basically three options: the northern route, the north central route, and the southern central route. The political power rested with Thomas Hartmann and other people from Missouri, and they wanted the terminus to be in St. Louis, where then the line could go to Chicago from there. And so they convinced President Lincoln to pick Council Bluffs, Iowa, as the eastern terminus of the transcontinental rail line. Sacramento would be the western terminus. That was approved, and Congress authorized that bill, and two companies were created to build that line. The Union Pacific would build west from Council Bluffs, and the Central Pacific would build east from Sacramento. There were four business people in Sacramento who had financed the topographical survey to find a route through the Sierra Madre to allow the western portion of the transcontinental rail line to be built. And those four men were Charles Crocker, Collis Huntington, Mark Stanford, and Leland Stanford. They were not railroad men, they were merchants. But they put up the money for that survey line to find a route through the Sierra Madre to allow the transcontinental rail line to be built. And so when in 1863 Congress authorized the Central Pacific Company, it was those four men who stood to gain financially from the completion of that line. And it took 6 years to complete, and Congress changed things somewhat. But in addition to financially backing the line, they also granted a land grant all along the line to the owners of both the Union Pacific and Central Pacific. And that line was opened in 1869 with a very famous photograph of the two trains coming together at Promontory in northern Utah. And one of the things about that photograph, as you will see, is even though the Chinese built much of the western portion of the line, there are no Chinese people in that photograph. They were all asked to get out because that was unacceptable, because there was enormous racism against the Chinese. That was the first line, but there was a problem with that line, of course. It ran through mountains where it snowed in the winter. And so the Southerners, after they lost the Civil War, said, well, the Southern Transcontinental Rail Line still makes sense. And it did, to Collis Huntington, Charles Crocker, Mark Hopkins, and Leland Stanford.
Well, they had all this experience now.
Well, that's correct.
I mean, they started out as merchants and running in grocery stores.
By the 1870s, they were four of the wealthiest men in the United States. Not only had they made a bunch of money off the construction of the line, but they were charging companies to move their freight from California east or to California. And so they were very well off. And so they had purchased what was called the Southern Pacific of California Railroad Company, and they decided to run the line from Sacramento and San Francisco down to Los Angeles, and then to take that line from Los Angeles to New Orleans along the 32nd parallel, because they owned a shipping company in New Orleans where they could ship goods either to the east coast of the United States or, more importantly, to Europe. And it was much faster to ship goods by rail that way, especially to Europe, than to ship goods by rail across the center of the country and put them on ships in New York. Since these four guys owned the shipping company, this would all be on their line.
They're like the Amazon of their day.
That is correct. And so they said, they tried to get Congress to give them some financial backing, but there had been so much fraud and corruption in the first line, particularly by Union Pacific, that the Congress said, get out of here. And so they got nothing. So they put up their own money, and they built the tracks to Yuma, where they got by 1877, and then they took a while, and then they got to where Casa Grande is today in May of 1879. And not only was it really hot, but they had run out of ties, so they stopped up in Casa Grande. And most of this work was being done by Chinese men, except for the actual track laying. That was done by white men. Because the Gadsden Purchase had been done to allow these tracks to be laid across flat desert, they worked very fast. The first line was an incredible engineering feat. The first transcontinental line was an incredible engineering feat. The second line, as I like to say, when those guys got across the Colorado River and the mountains just east of Yuma, and they looked out across that desert, they must have said, this is going to be a piece of cake. And it was. They had to build 2 bridges between Yuma and El Paso. 2 bridges, that was all. There were no tunnels, there was no blasting. It was like...
No dealing with the ice
no,
and the
no,
snow.
this was just, they could go very rapidly. And then they were basically laying the tracks on the ground. I mean, they put up ballast, but they were putting the tracks, there was very little grading going on. Anyways, and so the work had stopped in May of 1879 up in Casa Grande, and that is when several of the Chinese men working on the railroad up there decided, because they were all fired, I mean, they didn't have no work, right? The company wasn't going to pay them for the time they took off. And so some of those men moved to Tucson, and while a few Chinese men had moved here earlier, that was really the impetus for the growth of the Chinese community in Tucson, although it never got very large during territorial period, but there were several hundred Chinese people who did come here. Anyway, so in January then of 1880, Southern Pacific had enough ties and the weather had cooled down, so they started coming south. And on March 20th, 1880, they arrived at the depot to a grand ceremony, as we all know, because Tucson by that time had 7,000 people in it. Previously, 10 years earlier, it had 3,000 basically. So it had grown from a few hundred people in the Presidio. March 20th, 1880, the community of 7,000 people. I'm assuming almost everybody showed up at the depot.
I bet it was quite a crush.
To welcome that first ceremonial train, because who was on it but Charles Crocker, the president of the Southern Pacific of California Company, one of the most wealthy people in the United States, and he was presented then at the depot grounds with a silver spike by a man by the name of Esteban Ochoa, who was Tucson's first, and until recently, only Mexican-American mayor. He had been mayor in 1875, and he presented Crocker with a silver spike made from the silver mines down in Tombstone. And then there was a great banquet that week and that evening. And should I tell the Pope story? Okay. And so, as legend has it, there were a couple of thousand people who attended this banquet down by the Santa Cruz River. And according to the newspaper a couple days later, which printed all the speeches at that banquet in very tiny print, and it goes on for a few pages, right? Because they were congratulating themselves and patting themselves on the back to no end. And somebody, being a typical Tucsonan, during all these talks, which were frankly quite boring, got up and said, let me backtrack. Mayor Leatherwood
Mayor Leatherwood.
Mayor Robert Leatherwood had sent out telegrams on March 17th, St. Patrick's Day, to the President of the United States, the territorial governor up in Prescott, and a few other people, announcing the arrival of the railroad on March 20th to Tucson, because, as they said, this was going to put Tucson on the map and make this remote community, for the first time, have easy access for both passengers and freight. And along with Bishop Salpointe, he co-signed a telegram to the Pope announcing that the railroad was going to arrive. And those telegrams were sent on the 17th. And so on the afternoon of the 20th, among all these dull, boring speeches, somebody stood up and said, the Pope has responded to the mayor's telegram. And His Holiness wishes to congratulate the people of Tucson on, for the first time, being connected with the outside Christian world, and sends his benediction. But for his own edification, would ask, where in hell is Tucson? Anyway, so after that, the line was being built west to east, and they track layers kept moving further east along basically the 32nd parallel. One of the reasons Southern Pacific had come here was because of the silver coming out of the mines in Tombstone, because railroads make their money by shipping freight. Passengers provide a little bit of money, but not very much, whereas freight provides most of their revenue and most of their profits. And that's what Charles Crocker, who was really tight with the money of the company, was focused on, was getting to those freight from those Tombstone mines, as of course was the Santa Fe. There was only one problem. The silver mines of Tombstone played out, and so that freight disappeared.
Yeah, like about 1884.
That's correct.
Yeah.
And so they had to rely on the ranching of southern Arizona. There was still some mining going on here, but it was freight for the people who lived here, which generated a lot of their revenue for several years. And they lost money throughout the 19th century. This line didn't pay for itself. What that meant was Tucson was going to change dramatically, because for the first time, goods could get here easily. And one of the first goods to get here was ice, because they were shipping it in freight cars from California, and eventually they would bring in the equipment to make ice here. The other dramatic change that happened was construction had been done by adobe brick, because that was all that was available here, because we don't have large trees around here other than mesquite, and so houses were made out of adobe brick, and of course it was much better for the climate, because there was no cooling, folks. You had to live in the climate. And so what happened was the arrival of the railroad allowed lumber to be imported along with bricks, fired bricks. These are just dried by the sun.
Yeah, windows.
And windows and all this other stuff.
Oh,
and so what you have right over here at the Casa Cordova is a fine example of how that transition happened between pre-railroad and post-railroad, that life changed completely for the people who were here, because for the first time, not only could they live in a stick-built house if they had the money to build one, their diets changed, because before that, it had been agriculture from along the Santa Cruz, primarily a Mexican diet. And one of the big changes was they started importing oysters. Oysters were a craze for much of the late 19th century. And so oysters started coming in large numbers, along with other, what were considered American foodstuffs. And clothing changed. Instead of wearing clothes like seen in these pictures of the Presidio, which were reasonable for this climate, particularly women's clothing, they were bringing in these fashions from the East Coast, which were terribly inappropriate for this climate. But if you were going to be an American, you had to wear that sort of clothing. And so the railroad changed this town entirely.
You know, Dave, that was so interesting. That was great. Thanks a lot.
You're welcome.
You know, I hope I'll run into you again soon.
Oh, well, thank you again for inviting me. And
Yeah.
hope you learned a little bit.
Oh, I did. Let's head on out.
Now, thanks to Dave, we have a really good sense of how it was determined that a rail line would come through southern Arizona. But how would that railroad get built? Next time, I'll meet with historian Sandy Chan to learn about the Chinese railroad workers of southern Arizona. See you next time for another Vanished Vail.